All right, now you're aware. The webinar is being recorded. My name is Annie Dixon. I am the project manager for the Indianapolis IMPO's Regional Resiliency Snapshot. We kicked off this project earlier in 2023. We have a goal of completing this project before the end of the year. Joining us today includes Sarah Windmiller from Cambridge Systematics. This is our hired consultant that is assisting us with completing this planning process. We also have Karen Kieselewski. She is our project manager from the Cambridge Systematics side. And so we'll be flip-flopping between myself and the CS team to bring you information related to one of the deliverables that will come out of this planning process. Next slide, please. All right, quick agenda for today. Thank you all for joining us. We hope to make the most of your time here today. We'll start out with some quick introductions and a project overview about what the Regional Resiliency Snapshot is and what we're hoping to inform you about today and the information we hope to gather from you as well. We'll give you a little bit of background on the federal PROTECT funding source, the requirements related to that, as well as the role of this resilient improvement plan that we are working on. We're going to cover the hazards and threats that have been identified that will be included in this assessment of transportation infrastructure and how that will be playing into the vulnerability assessment scoring tool, or VAST, which we are using to complete part of this work. This is a tool by the Federal Highway Administration that we'll be using for this process. We'll wrap up with some information on criticality. That's something that we would like to get your input on, and anyone else that should be contributing to this process. And then we'll wrap up with next steps and questions. A few housekeeping items. If you have questions along the way, feel free to submit them into the Q&A and share them with all so that we can address those at the end. Any that we don't get to, we can distribute answers out via email or through the Indianapolis IMPO website. We will have some time for Q&A at the end, so feel free to raise that hand at the end and we'll let you come off of mute. Last thing, all this information will be on the IMPO website. I think I've said that a few times. We want to make sure that anybody that needs to contribute to this process has access to the information. Next slide. Quick project overview for you. The Regional Resiliency Snapshot is a new plan for the Indianapolis IMPO. We have a couple of different objectives with this planning process. One is to kind of assess the holistic regional resilience of central Indiana. So that includes IMPO planning, the IMPO planning area, including Marion County and the surrounding counties. So this is us attempting to identify, how well is this region prepared to handle future shocks and stressors, whether those be economic or something like a future pandemic or issues related to climate change. We also hope to position this region for federal funding related to the PROTECT funding opportunity. I will note here that our analysis likely will not be completed by that August 18th deadline for this first round of funding, but it will be completed by the time there is another round for funding. Last piece here is to kind of identify vulnerabilities for the region, both that are transportation in nature in terms of asset vulnerability, as well as a more holistic overall assessment of the region. So we're looking for kind of two main deliverables to come out of this planning process. One is this holistic regional resiliency snapshot. The second is this assessment of transportation infrastructure. Next slide, please. This is a quick overview of the project roadmap and kind of where we are in terms of task completion. We're engaging a stakeholder group throughout the planning process. They will meet next month. We're also engaging the public. We have some public engagement opportunities coming up this week. We have gone through the process of identifying some resources that we should evaluate for vulnerabilities and identifying what those threats might be to those resources. So we've done that through public engagement as well as stakeholder engagement. The star here in task 5 is what we are starting now. This is the risk-based assessment of transportation infrastructure, and this is what is related to that federal PROTECT funding source. One of the final tasks is kind of producing those two different deliverables, identifying the vulnerability of the region, providing recommendations, and also assessing that transportation infrastructure. And then we have another task down here related to regional data tracking. So you all are tuning in here specifically for this kind of highly technical risk-based assessment of transportation infrastructure. So that's what we're hoping to get your feedback on today. Next slide, please. Just wanted to put a reminder in here. We are working very hard to center equity throughout the planning process, and we have gathered some input from stakeholders and the public about how best to do that. So as we move through this process of explaining kind of this assessment of transportation infrastructure, just want to keep equity kind of at the top of our minds here, especially as we look at kind of how critical some of these assets are and getting feedback on that. Maintain kind of these main groups in the back of your mind in terms of how we ensure that this plan is equitable and that we're not causing accidental increased disbenefits to some of these communities that already face some additional challenges. And with that, next slide, please. I will pass it off to Sarah with our Cambridge Systematics team to cover some of the background on this assessment and the federal Protect funding.
Great. Thanks, Annie. So yeah, as Annie mentioned, want to give a quick overview of, why are we jumping into this? Why has this suddenly become a vital part for a lot of agencies all across the country? And a lot of it has to do with this bipartisan infrastructure law or that from the IIJA. And this introduced the Protect program to improve resiliency for extreme weather and climate change. And Protect, since FHWA likes their acronyms, stands for Promoting Resilient Operations for Transformative, Efficient, and Cost-Saving Transportation. So this program provides $250 to $300 million per year through fiscal year 2026 and discretionary funds for various resiliency projects all across the country. This funding pot is available, but in order to increase your federal share for resiliency improvements, you need to create a real resilient improvement plan, or a RIP, with a prioritized list of projects. When you create one of these, your federal share increases by 7%. If it's incorporated into your long range plan, and it increases by 3% additional to that. So what is a RIP? What's supposed to go into it? Well, part of the Protect funding, they did provide 14 different elements that should be included, must be included, and could be included if it makes sense. So these elements are listed on the right, the 14 different ones. This ranges from being a system-wide approach to being consistent with state and local hazard mitigation plans, considering natural infrastructure, using a long-range planning period, just a lot of different things that need to be required, could be, or are required if it's appropriate for the different jurisdiction. For the ones we have circled in green, so this is all of what the plan shall do, so what it must do, and then a few of the ones that are as appropriate. The ones that are in green are what are being addressed using VAST. So using our risk-based assessment tool, the analysis we're doing, we're encompassing long-range planning activities. It's a system-wide approach. We've looked at state and local hazard mitigation plans to try to align with those as best as possible. And of course, VAST, it's basically a risk-based assessment of vulnerability. So element number 4, we're particularly checking off pretty heavily. And through this, our end goal is to have this risk-informed, prioritized project list that will be able to use in different programming, long-range plans, asset management plans. So a lot of different functions and a lot of different collaboration from this. So what is risk exactly? So in the Protect program, is providing funding for infrastructure that's at risk. And it's promoting this risk-based assessment of different vulnerabilities in particularly in your transportation network, but in other aspects of your region as well. So it's looking at the vulnerability of the asset. So what's the likelihood of an event or a disruption occurring? And what's the consequence of that event and disruption occurring? So this is comprised of 3 different components. The consequence is looking at, so if it occurs, how much money will that cost, essentially? Vulnerability is, what's the exposure to this hazard? And this is really where VAST comes into play, looking at the exposure, the sensitivity, and the adaptive capacity of the different assets. And then the third component is this probability. So what's the likelihood of it occurring? So just as an example, let's say we have a roadway segment that's in a 100-year floodplain, and this roadway segment, if you need to build it from scratch, would cost $1 million. So kind of going through the calculations, I have my little laser pointer. So going through the calculations, the likelihood of the event occurring, the probability, it's in a 100-year floodplain. So it has a 1% probability of occurring each year. The vulnerability, so given an event has occurred, what's the estimated consequence that would be realized? Let's say for our purpose, if the roadway gets flooded, it's all in a 100-year floodplain, it would all be impacted. And then the third one, this consequence, so what's the outcome of the event occurring? So that would be replacing a bridge or a roadway that's $1 million. So this would be the math of 1% times 100% times 1 million, which would be $10,000 of risk. So that's a very high level, not everything is that simple. But all of that goes together to calculate the risk, and we'll have this for all of the different assets, which we can then feed into the prioritization, and really that key component in a RIP. So the prioritization is comprised of the different risk and the criticality. So while the risk helps identify what's the relevant cost to these transportation events and disruptions occurring, it doesn't evaluate how important that asset is to the community and the economy. So for example, an asset that's in a dense urban area, high traffic volume, it's on a transit line, it's close to a hospital, this could be more important than a 2-lane road that has only farmland surrounding it, assuming that they both had the same risk between them. So it's looking through it, these two different lenses, considering both the risk and this criticality or the community importance to see how critical the asset is. And then using these two different lenses, we can create a prioritized list. So the projects and assets that would be a high criticality, high risk would rise to the top of our prioritized list. The ones that are high risk, moderate criticality, or moderate risk, high criticality would kind of be the next tier, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of the in-plan, a high level overview of risk and the RIP. Wanted to go a little bit deeper into our specific work that we've done, and really starting with the hazards and the threats. So this is one of the first steps in creating resiliency. Like, okay, what are we concerned about? What are the different hazards, weather events, climate changes, what have you, that could impact our transportation network? And there's a lot of them out there. We started with over 15 different possible threats. And this was developed through a list that we initially had through our work in other jurisdictions, but then also reaching out to the stakeholder group that Annie mentioned and the public to see, did we miss anything? Do we need to add on anything as well? And this could be used for VAST or could be used as noting in our plan and planning for it in other manners that not necessarily feed into VAST, but something we still wanted to note. And for our purpose, we did want it to be transportation focused. So these are the list of the 15 threats that we kind of compiled once we started talking with everyone and the stakeholder and the public side. Quite a lot here, trying to put all of this into VAST. It's quite an undertaking. We wanted to keep it between 3 to 5. That's more of a manageable level. And then some of these are, while they are a pretty big threat and hazard for the region, or they definitely can be, they might not necessarily impact the transportation network. So the food shortage, water shortage are the ones that kind of immediately come to mind. If you have a food shortage, it's not going to decrease pavement conditions or bridge conditions. It would impact, of course, you know, the, I'm blanking on the name, like freight and things like that. But as far as conditions and when it have a noticeable impact, but it's still something that's important to the region. And I did want to hand it to Andy really quick to talk more about the process of our public and stakeholder feedback and how we distilled this list of 15 down to the vital 4.
Yeah, something that was really interesting as we started compiling the list of potential threats to the assets, we took a look at the state of Indiana's hazard mitigation plan, as well as all of the existing county level hazard mitigation plans. So almost every county in central Indiana has a hazard mitigation plan that's been completed. So we took a look at those and pulled out those common threats that were identified that were ranked as kind of highest impact in each one of those hazard mitigation plans, and brought those to both a stakeholder group made up of kind of regional representatives from individuals working in transportation to emergency management to sustainability to safety, et cetera, to that stakeholder group. And so we had a discussion back when we were trying to narrow this list of threats. And we also, at that meeting, kind of developed additional threats. So something that was really interesting that came out of that process was there's definitely an interest in studying resiliency, and the stakeholders had a lot to add to the list, actually. So we had a discussion about some prioritization, as well as we deployed a survey for our stakeholders to help us prioritize some of these threats, because it's outside of the scope to cover 15 different threats in VAST. So we gathered their feedback. We also took this information to the public via a public survey in MetroQuest. We promoted this on social media, and we also attended some in-person events, including the Earth Day Indiana Festival, where we got some input on helping us to prioritize some of these, so that we can kind of narrow that list down. We have additional engagement plan that's kind of identified down here below, but to give a high-level summary of the feedback that we received, there was actually a stark difference between what the public considered some of the highest ranking threats and what the stakeholders considered some of the highest ranking threats. So the public in conversations and in the MetroQuest survey prioritized policy, civil disturbance, and extreme temperature as the greatest threats for central Indiana. They also specifically honed in on climate change impacts, as well as the urban heat island effect. So we saw the public kind of shift to less physical threats and more focused on kind of civil disturbance and policy as well. The stakeholders went kind of the opposite direction. Stakeholders were very focused on very physical threats that could be more easily integrated into VAST. So the stakeholders actually prioritized extreme temperature, flood, hail, severe weather, and air quality. And so we decided to, for the purposes of conducting an actual physical assessment of transportation infrastructure, lean more into those physical threats for this assessment based on that feedback. And we hope to integrate the public's feedback on some of these less physical aspects into that kind of more holistic snapshot. So today we're hoping to gather some input from you all on this, as well as taking some of the criticality pieces to the stakeholders as well as the public in this upcoming engagement. So based on all of that feedback, we're moving forward with a select number of threats that I think is on the next slide. So I'm going to pass it back to Sarah here.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, these are the 4 more physical threats that we've selected. So looking at extreme heats, flooding, winter storms like severe winter weather, snow, ice, things like that, and then tornadoes and winds. So these are kind of like the first building blocks for our risk and vulnerability assessments. So with that, we'll jump into kind of more of the VAST tool. So VAST, it's looking specifically at vulnerability. So if you remember that equation, that kind of flow chart that I had a few slides back, it's just looking at the middle section. So vulnerability, and it's walking through each component of how to assess the vulnerability of different assets. So it's looking at the exposure. So is the asset in an area experiencing the select hazard? So is it experiencing extreme heat? Is it experiencing flooding, et cetera? It's looking at sensitivity. So when it's exposed to the hazard, how sensitive is it? So if it's flooded, is how particularly bad, I guess, would that flooding be to said asset? And then the third one's looking at adaptive capacity. So when the roadway is flooded, are there a lot of alternative routes that people can take? Or is it a major roadway network where it has thousands, tens of thousands of cars each day? And all of this is done in FHWA's VAST tool. You can go online and download it. It's completely free and Excel based. So it's actually pretty easy to pick up. It offers step-by-step guidance, quite a lot of different links and information along the way as well. So it's pretty nicely done. So we can walk through what goes into this VAST tool step by step. So the first one is just simply identifying the assets and the hazards. So in our case, for this Indianapolis work, we have two assets. We're looking at roadways and we're looking at bridges. And then the hazards, which are also known as stressors, looking at the four ones that we identified. So the extreme heat, flooding, winter storms, and tornado. And for this step, it's just identifying what it is. You don't need to input any data yet. Step two, it's looking at the asset side, a little bit more detail. So in here, you'll actually enter, the unique IDs of the different assets. So in this example, I pulled in some bridge data, just made up a unique ID, or maybe there was one in the data set I had, put in the asset name, and then the lat and lon, because I had it, though it's not necessarily required. For roadway, you do something similar. You'd have an ID of the roadway, the name, and you can add columns if you want. So if you want to include like functional classification, maybe the jurisdiction that it's in, what county, you're able to add that as well. But at this point, you don't need any additional underlying data, so to say. The third one starts diving into these three components: the exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. It's looking at this for particular assets and hazards that you put in. So this one is just selecting like, okay, so what exposure indicator are you interested in? So in this example, said, okay, it's located in a floodplain. I can say yes or no. I can even indicate, is it a 100-year or 500-year floodplain if I want to get more specific. With the sensitivity, you can look at things like, well, what's the age of the asset, or what's the condition of the asset, and input that for, or just select it at this point. And then the third one's looking at the adaptive capacity. So how important or vital is this asset? So looking at ADT, the ability for having an alternative route, or how far it is to get to the next bridge over, for example. And VAST does include suggestions. It has a fairly nice list of what's been done previously. It has some links to where you could get that data, or just some information of, who do I usually talk to get said information in my agency. So again, you don't need any data yet. It's just selecting, this is what I want to concentrate on. So this third one is looking, it's kind of the first time where we actually input specific data. So we selected what type of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity indicators we're worried about. And here we enter that specific data. So looking at what's the age of a bridge, is that bridge in a 100 or 500-year floodplain, things like that. So this table in the yellow is where you input it. VAST has a lot of macros. So all this information in gray is actually inputted automatically. It's just pulling from other sheets, which is nice. And you can enter this for multiple scenarios. So for the Indianapolis one, for example, we have two scenarios. We have the 2030 and the 2050 scenario. And then the third step after entering this data is to provide scores. So this could be done kind of in two ways. The first one is if you have multiple indicators, should you consider them equally or should you consider one more than the other? So for this example, for the sensitivity, I brought in the bridge age and the scour rating. So I can say, okay, treat them the same 50%, or maybe treat one more than the other. So 75, 25%. I can go in and change that. You can additionally change, depending how your data is set up, kind of the different ranges and the scores applicable to them. So for example, with this scour rating for the bridge, it's numeric. So it's 1 to 3, 3 to 5, etc. But I need to tell VAST, okay, is 1 good or is 1 bad? So that's when the score comes in and I can assign points to that. I can additionally edit the ranges and the scales of these. So maybe instead of 1 to 3, I want 1 to 5. I can put that in, change it on the fly very easily. Or if you, instead of having ranges, maybe you want all 9 numbers to be separated out as their own thing. You can do that with the boxes to the bottom as well. So it's pretty flexible in how you organize data and how you want the data to be analyzed and considered. So after that, we selected our hazards, selected our assets, we put information about both. And from that, it's pretty easy sailing from there. You're able to put different weights of our 3 components. So the exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, by default, we treat all of them the same. But for a particular reason, if you want to change that weighting, you're able to. And then otherwise, the rest of the sheet is actually doing the calculations. So it's looking at what's the exposure score, what's the sensitivity score, adaptive capacity score, and is giving a total vulnerability score. And then from there, you're able to see the results, filter them, sort them, and even put in information about how much it would cost to replace the assets. So VAST can take that and kind of do additional analyses based off of that and kind of go back to that risk calculation I had in the earlier side. So this has a full table of results. You can now copy it and bring it into GIS if you want a map of it, or bring it into a different workbook if you want to play around with it some more. VAST also has this vulnerability dashboard. So it takes all the results and identifies, okay, what's the top assets that are most vulnerable, gives you stats on, what's the breakdown of different scores, what's really high, what's medium, what's low, things like that. So it's a nice additional visual summary of the results. And just to kind of give a glimpse of what we're planning on putting into VAST, I think as we speak, I think my colleague is working on this. But this is the example for our flood hazard or flood threat, looking at our 2 assets, roads and bridges. And for exposure for both of them, since we're looking at the floodplain, we're looking at this best available floodplain map. So we're going to see, or really flag, okay, is this roadway in a floodplain? Yes or no? Is this bridge in a floodplain? Yes or no? Put that into VAST. Looking at the sensitivity. So how could the condition of the asset change? For roads, we're looking at pavement condition. So what's the current condition of the pavement? Is it poor? Is it good? And then similarly for bridge, what's the bridge condition? And then last is adaptive capacity. So how vital is this asset? And right now we're looking at density, trying to get to what's the alternative route or the length of the detour if said road was closed. So for roads, we're looking at line density. Are there a lot surrounding said road? Or is it you have to go a bit of mile of your way? And then similarly with bridge, if I need to cross a river or a stream or what have you, I'm able to cross it, a little ways farther down, or do I have to reroute and go out of my way in order to make it to the other side? Then we did want to pull in a few examples. So we did something similar for New Hampshire. They were looking at sea level rise, which is slightly different than what we're looking at in Indianapolis. They had a scenario further out because that data is just more robust for sea levels, 2050 and 2100 scenarios in the future. Just wanted to give a snippet of the data set that we had, what it looks like, and then the ability to bring this into a map and just ability to summarize it. So we have the two different scenarios, the 2050 on the left and the 2100 on the right, and just looking at the different like summary of how many links are we concerned about, what's the mileage of those links, and able to do a more robust in-depth look at that. So that's more on the risk side of the equation for prioritizing projects. I wanted to shift gears and talk a bit more about criticality. So if you recall in one of the earlier slides, we had this matrix looking at risk and criticality. So risk is basically vast, is what we went over in the previous few slides. And then criticality is looking at this community importance. So it's looking at how vital an asset is to the community and the economy. So the importance, the usage, and then also this is where equity really comes into play, is the surrounding socioeconomic characteristics. And all of this is kind of built on top of each other. So this graphic, which has the different maps, we have a lot of different criticality factors that we're putting one on top of the other to see, okay, is this asset, how many boxes is it checking, essentially? And for our criticality list, here's our current factors that we're considering. So it's under 3 different buckets, looking at mobility and the use, the connectivity, and the equity in people. So for mobility and use, this is really looking at the roadway network. So what's the functional classification? What's the total AADT, truck AADT, and the number of transit routes? So this is looking at, well, how important, how vital is it from moving around the region? The second one, this connectivity, is looking at what are the surrounding different assets and different destinations. So we pulled out hospitals, pulled out grocery stores, and other non-motorized transportation infrastructure. So looking at walkways, bicycle ways, and sidewalks. And then the final component is equity in people. So looking at population density, the employment density, and Justice 40 and these transportation disadvantaged communities. So looking at all of this together to see, who lives there, is it heavily used, or not even if it's heavily used, but is it around, a high concentration of people and jobs, and paying attention to that equity lens again with the Justice 40. So all this will be kind of stacked on top of each other, perhaps changing the weighting of some more important than others, but then we'll be able to see, which assets are checking these boxes more than others to feed on to that prioritization matrix. Yeah, and that's about it. With next steps, yeah, we wanted your feedback of what we've been doing so far, particularly the criticality. Is there anything particularly we're missing by August 8th? As Annie mentioned, this will be up on the website, this webinar, and other information about the project. And the next meeting, we'll have the full transportation vulnerability assessment, the VAST assessment completed. But next time we meet, and our technical webinar for the subject matter experts is on September 14th.
Hey, Sarah, can I jump in at this
Yeah.
point here? So wanted to reiterate kind of a couple of points here. Sarah, can you go back one slide, please, or
Sure.
two to the. Yes. Okay. So Sarah has walked us through kind of how the VAST tool will work for that one piece of that matrix that she showed. So all of our transportation assets for functional classes 3 through 6 will be mapped on with that VAST tool. So that's analyzing those threats that our stakeholders and the public have identified. And then remember that y-axis is this kind of criticality score. So these are the 3 categories that we have proposed, and then kind of those sub bullets underneath. This is the key piece that we're seeking input from you all on. Of course, we're open to feedback on kind of the VAST toolkit as well, but as Sarah mentioned, this is a tool put out by FHWA, so there's only some pieces of it that we can tweak. So some of that being weighting in terms of that adaptive capacity and sensitivity, et cetera, but these criticality factors are what we're really interested in getting your feedback on. So I think we had on the other slide to go ahead and email me if you have feedback here, but I think what we're looking for is, are there any of these 3 categories? Should one be weighted more than the other as we start scoring these assets based on the criticality piece on that y-axis? Are there other pieces of information within these categories that should be weighted higher than the other, or are we missing something? So for example, in connectivity, something that we saw from our public and our stakeholders, as we asked them about regional resources, they were very interested in emergency management centers, hospitals, grocery stores, et cetera. And that's how these got integrated into that connectivity piece. So when we're looking at a specific transportation asset to kind of map that criticality, we're going to be putting this data in to see, does it serve a hospital? Does it serve a grocery store? What's the population around it? What's the total truck count? What's the total annual daily traffic count, et cetera, and kind of producing that score. So this is what we really like your feedback on. And this kind of graphic is also located on the Indianapolis IMPO website. Can you go forward a couple of slides, Sarah? If you don't mind to, yes. Just wanted to reiterate here, we're requesting your feedback by August 8th. That's via an email to me. Again, this information is on the IMPO website. We have not completed the full run of the VAST assessment yet, but we hope to present that at the next meeting of this group, which will be September 14th at 10 a.m. Via Zoom. That will also be remote. And at that point, we will have results of this vulnerability assessment. I wanted to reiterate one more piece here on Protect. So reminder, we're doing this deliverable as part of the kind of federal Protect funding source. Those funds are available for transportation assets specifically to increase the resiliency of those assets. So only a certain amount of money can be used for capacity expansion, but if you're applying to the federal government for Protect funding, you're only eligible to apply for improvements to a proposed asset that are specific to increasing that asset's resilience. So we can get some information out if you're curious about that funding source, but just wanted to kind of reiterate that point. Last piece, if anybody has any questions at this point, I think we're happy to take those. I don't see any in the Q&A box. Feel free to type those if you prefer them typed out, or I believe you have the ability to raise your hand, and I think we can let you come off of mute if I remember correctly. This is all the information that we have for you today. So if there's any questions, we're happy to take those. I take silence as we're doing an excellent job. One question I see here from Ryan Wilhite, the other subcategories are available on the FHWA website. Ryan, can I let you come off of mute here so that you can elaborate? There you go. Should be able to come off with mute here.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
it's related to that slide that you presented with the 3 categories: mobility and use, connectivity, and equity. I know there's like metrics underneath those. I guess I meant those. Are there other things in mobility and use besides total AADT or truck AADT, those kind of things?
We can add to them. These are criticality factors we proposed.
Okay, so what criticality factors are available that we could choose from?
Do you have one in mind?
Nope. No, I do not.
Okay.
But you all might. And it's just the question that I have. I want to understand what those factors would be that, might be interesting to add or, replace.
So Annie, if I may, one thing, we can run some of these criticality factors through VAST, but we've decided with this large number to do a separate GIS analysis. So there are no, while each of these kind of tie to some of the categories Federal Highway has identified in the notice of funding opportunity, it uses them only as examples. We've tried to come up with a list that's fairly robust, but small enough so that we don't start with getting duplications and things like that. But there could be something, very unique to the region that people feel is important with extreme weather or climate or other disruptions, that we could maybe include, access to the airport, for example. I mean, I'm throwing a wild thing. It's not a wild thing, but that would be something. So it's whatever, the region and the community thinks. If
Okay.
that's, I hope to give you ideas.
Yes, thank you.
So if there are additional kind of pieces here that you'd like to see added to any of these categories, or if you have feedback on the weighting of the categories or the pieces that are, I guess, sub bullets under each, that's what we're interested in gathering from you all that are specific to the region. We also will be taking these to the public this week as well to get feedback. Any other questions we can answer? Going once, I'll give you to 1:45. This is going to be a long 60 seconds. Any other questions we can answer for you all about how the VAST tool works? Any questions on the Protect funding source or the feedback that we're requesting from you all? I think we have a question from the audience. Brad Davis, you should be able to come off of mute.
Yes, hello. I just had a quick question when you're talking about just roads and bridges, but are you looking at other infrastructure assets that might be vulnerable, like utilities or maybe water availability, water resources, anything of that nature?
Great question. So the stakeholders also raised similar concerns. They were very concerned about public utilities and water as well. For the VAST tool, we are not inputting those assets. One thing that we did see was it was really difficult to get information and GIS information on utility GIS spatial locations for security reasons. So we hope to cover those in the more kind of holistic snapshot, but we won't be inputting those into VAST.
Okay.
Would you find that particularly helpful as a piece that we should input into VAST for transportation, for the transportation network, or are you interested in seeing that being evaluated with some of this criteria?
I thought those were two critical components to being vulnerable to
Understood.
disruption. And But I understand you're just limiting yourself to transportation in the road bridge sense at this point.
Correct. And so, as I said, we hope to incorporate that in the overall holistic snapshot as well. But VAST is also a tool that, because it's Excel based, we can continue to use the tool and develop it and make edits. And so if that information becomes available, or if that's something that our stakeholders or our board is interested in, we can take a look at trying to conduct some of that. I will say I'm not sure if there's any limitations with VAST being a tool by FHWA, how applicable we could make it for some water resources, probably a little more applicable to utilities as well, but that's something we can look at. But in this kind of initial round, we're not going in that direction for this first round.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the question. Any other questions we can answer? If you do have additional questions, feel free to email me. Sarah, can you switch back to the contact slide, please?
Sure.
Okay, perfect. Once again, we're requesting your feedback and anybody else that should be reviewing this and contributing to this by August 8th. This information will be posted on the Indianapolis IMPO website, as well as a recording of this webinar. So if you missed something, or if someone needs to review this and needs to watch the whole thing all the way through, it will be available there. Please send feedback to me. My contact information is here on this slide, or if you have additional questions that we can answer. Otherwise, we will see you September, I want to say 14th. At the next presentation of the actual results of the VAST assessment. So really interested in your feedback here before we get to that point of an actual prioritized list. Thank you all for your time today, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Thank you.